And the idea of normal is is a kind of vegetative state where nothing happens. But that's what everybody tried to aspire to. But I think it's a word that people are constantly using to exhort you to behave better. Why don't you be normal? It's not normal to wear your hair long. It's not normal to wear Levi's. It's not normal to listen to rock and roll. It's not normal to read comic books. There's a whole list of a million things that everybody does that isn't normal.
Well, what makes you think they look at your clothes?
Oh, because the other fellas wear sweaters or just shirts, not a regular suit like mine.
Well, wear a sweater then.
Another rule: fit in with the group. Don't stand out. Conform in your actions and your appearance.
But if you just slow down the rush and pressure of your feelings a little, then judgment has a better chance to take hold and guide you away from wrong behavior.
Sort of a nightmare. Looking from the outside, I'm sure it didn't seem that way to observer, but for me, I felt so lonely. I was popular and I didn't have those problems. I wasn't a nerd or anything like that, but there just wasn't anybody from my planet, is the way that I kind of described it.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I had so much bottled up inside of me.
Most kids trying to behave properly did keep it all bottled up inside. But a minuscule number began to rebel. It was a preview of coming attractions.
What startles me when I look back at my yearbook photos now, they all look so old. Everybody looks so old. I mean, they look like little adults. You know, they don't. It's startling to me how old, how already getting into the groove all of these people look with their flat top crew cuts, and then every so often, you know, you turn the page and you see the guy with the ducktail, and you know, here's the rebel.
You know, sometimes the events of decades can crystallize in a moment, and it seems as if overnight there's this historic change. When you look back at it, you say, oh, well, this was building up, and for years there was this person and this person and this group, and they were networking and this, and then there was a shift. The women's movement had many origins. In part, it owes its renewed birth to the civil rights movement, because there was then a lesson for the women of America of how blacks at that time were taking their life into their own hands.
Is my bacon ready yet? 20 past 8. Some more toast, Teen. Hey, Teen, why don't you get cracking on a thorough fall house cleaning campaign around here? Get the floors waxed, get the windows washed, get this place looking as if civilized people are in residence, Gee, that's a little light, isn't it?
Yee, shit, you.
Sorry, I hurried it.
Sweetie, have a little more damson plum preserve, please.
Just throw that coffee in his face, god damn it.
50 years ago last year, women got to vote, I hear. But we just sat on dusty shelves because we never helped ourselves. Married men can still be free, but a woman, what is she? A servant with no pay for life, just so she can stay a wife. A status symbol with a ring. Tell me what that's gonna bring. A legal right to bear his kids while liberation he forbids. So ladies, drop the kitchen mop and we'll be heard somehow. Men have made a mess of things they should be stopped by now.
In 1970, America was still very much a man's world. More women than ever were joining the workforce, but at the same time, they were still expected to be the traditional housewives and mothers of a generation earlier. In some states, women could not obtain credit cards or mortgages without a male cosigner, and nationally, they were paid an average of 59 cents for every dollar a man earned. In short, American women were still second-class citizens.
Of the phenomena, which is really a human phenomena, and everybody should be concerned about. What we're saying, there's a closer definition of what we are is free people, free Americans. As free Americans, we believe all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Free people, this more is a closer definition to what the phenomena is. We really don't know, like the Neolithic age is over and some new age is happening. What is it? We'll have to see, I don't know.
Look around you, nothing works. The only thing the kid is presented with is when you grow up, look, you can join the army, you can go to war, you can get a gig working as an engineer and become a vegetable and drive to work in your own car, in your own big metal box. And, it looks absurd. People in their metal boxes like this going all over from job to job, frustrated, uptight. What joy is there in life? Life is and should be ecstasy. Being alive should be a joy, and it's a drag for most people because they've never had a chance to figure it out for themselves what they wanted to do. You were a this, or you're going to be a this. I'm going to school to do this. When you go to school for the right to earn, to learn to earn, to buy more pieces of metal junk, and I think the kids that are here that are getting into this whole thing now, this evolution now is one that is a result of the alienation that a child feels, particularly a middle-class American feels, of not really relating to his family. Father's somebody that goes to work, and he gets shoved into school and is constantly subject to one authority or another. And when he turns on, he sees, wow, there's something else.
Another name the hippies have adopted for themselves is the love generation. They like to feel an expanded, communal sort of love. They enjoy a sense of being part of a group, united by general affection for each other, a group where people serve and support each other. The hippies are capable of extremely hard work, even though they tend to approach work, as the rest of us do, sport. Some of them are very successful. This is the house of a popular local band which plays hard rock music. They call themselves the Grateful Dead. They live together comfortably in what could be called affluence. There are many other similar houses or apartments in Haight-Ashbury, maintained by hippies who work in places where employers do not mind bizarre dress or long hair. Their concept of a new style of life unites them, and that concept is, in most cases, drawn from the drug experience. The Grateful Dead themselves acknowledge they have used LSD. Warren Wallace asked them what they thought the hippie movement was trying to accomplish.
What we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about any kind of power. We're not thinking about any of those kind of struggles. We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. That's not what we want. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to hurt anybody. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, you know, and like think about moving the whole human race ahead a step or a few steps. And,
or half a step.
Yeah, or a half a step, or anything.
Or at least not
more positive.
At least not going around in circles like it is now.
Do you think that your movement or your idea, the hip idea, is essentially connected up with drugs?
Yeah, I would say that's a large part of the framework.
I think that most of the people who are hippies now came to it through drugs.
Yeah, but it's not a dope movement. We're not trying to.
We're not
spread
pushing dope. I think personally that the more people turn on, the better world it's going to be. Expanding your consciousness, changing yourself.
Well, most of us have given up the psychedelic drugs anyway. Yeah, right. Well, we've learned something from them, and now we're kind of playing around with that knowledge.
It was the light at the end of the tunnel. These things can be said. These things can be expressed. There is another way. You know, we don't simply have to put up with what is.
In this community are practicing what people have spoken about for centuries, and it threatens to overthrow the rest of the American establishment, which is built upon the motives of greed, anger, lust, and self-interest. The idea for the Oracle came to me in a dream. I woke up in the morning and remembered seeing a newspaper being read all over the world with rainbows on it. And I went out in the streets and started to tell people. I had a dream about a newspaper being read all around the world with rainbows on it. Everyone said, wow, what a great idea. Let's do it.
Faction of poets, artists, and visionaries who wanted to create something that would transcend the sociological trap of us and them and the political dualities of right and left. A form of expression that would advance the change of consciousness and custom that was happening in the Haight.
They were about personal authenticity and taking responsibility for your own visions.
Right before the 70s when everything switched around, but this was so, you could see this starting to open up.
At this point, we're going to leave Golden Gate Park to go into the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco.
If you're going to San Francisco,
I would say that the last 18 months has seen a tremendous increase of the so-called hippies.
In America, the young people were beginning to rebel against their 50s-style parents. It just wasn't cool to be concerned about college or a profession.
Suddenly, these things called hippies emerged, you know, and they were, you know, they weren't conforming. I think maybe especially shocking were the guys who, when you look back on it now, were taking on a lot of feminine values.
The philosophy that they brought with them and that was engendered right in that place was that everything would be free. It was a mini utopia.
It completely freaked out so many American families. They just couldn't deal with it. When they had kids who suddenly wore weird clothes or let their hair grow long, came back from college looking strange or with a weird-looking boyfriend or girlfriend or something like that, people got locked up, you know, because the parents could not handle the idea that everything they worked for to establish their toehold in the American dream was being thrown away by their son, who was joining the three kids and jumping in the VW van and going to Haight-Ashbury.
There is no family so busy, but that it can come together in the evening for a dinner date, which will give its members something to look back upon with happiness.
Somebody who came to Britain, I noticed long-haired people I knew and kids with earrings, gold earrings and shoulder-length hair, going home and having a drink with their dad in the pub, who had a short haircut. And It was very relaxed.
One's parents didn't really, I mean, they might have objected, but they were more accommodating, I think, because they didn't perceive it in the same way as the Americans did. They didn't perceive it as a threat at all. They just thought, oh, it's a phase he's going through. This is his teenage years, you know, and he wants to express himself.
It's all too beautiful. It's all too beautiful.
But the difference about 67, and I think the thing that makes it such a unique year, and a year that still, to this day, gets right-wing politicians steam coming out of their ears. You know, they feel it was like that's where everything went wrong, is because of LSD.
And I mean, drugs has to be mentioned as being a part of it because people's consciousness was expanded by marijuana and to a certain extent LSD.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times. I don't know what everyone's so angry about.
You know, when Paul McCartney acknowledged taking it, it was blown up in all the newspapers, shock, horror. You know, they busted the Stones, and there was a huge trial, and there was a feeling of alarm among the powers that be that things were getting out of control, that young people were going off in a dangerous direction which nobody could understand. And it did have to do with drugs, but it also had to do with dress, it had to do with music, and most important, it did have to do with that sense that you could change things. And young people felt they could, and in fact did.
San Fran 60s. Stories of the hippies, the summer of love, and San Francisco. An old friend from the 60s said of these stories, "But we all had experiences like that." "That's the point," I replied. "These stories aren't unique, they're representative."
In 1968, almost every American knew what these were: hippies. A few of the estimated 16 million cultural rebels who abandoned 1950s notions about how life in America should be lived. And by 1968, almost everyone in America knew what these people were too: student protesters, activists, part of a small but vocal group of political rebels who were fighting not only to end a war, but to transform, even dismantle, the American system.
The music was something that you could talk about with your friends and that you couldn't talk about with people who were older than you. It gave people a sense of generational solidarity and a sense that they were different, and a sense different from the rest of the country, different from any other generation in American history, that they were in some ways special and blessed. And it gave them a sense of being embattled, of being considered outsiders, reprobates, bad people.
I wanna be a Beatle. I never pull my hair. So rock and look.
These kids may not look like it, but they are the leading edge of a youth rebellion, a movement that would ignite one of the most powerful and pervasive cultural shifts in United States history.
Hippest boy in town. We do what we want. We say what we want. We wear what we want. We look exactly the way we want to, yeah. The time has come for the whole to know that we all can conform to the role.
To understand how and why so many people stopped conforming to the rules, remember that appearances are misleading. And especially in the 1960s, appearances were very important. A perfect example is hair.
Do you think these haircuts have come to stay?
Well, this one has, you know, it's stuck on good and proper now.
Is that a Beatle haircut you got? How'd you work it out?
Well, I put my hair flop around until it's all messy.
What do your parents say about it?
They don't like it.
Are you a boy? Are you a girl? blonde hair. You look like a girl.
You would physically get approached, and quiz or whatever it was. A lot of people did not understand long hair at all. It was really a threat to them. It really flew in the face of conventionalism. And long hair was a flag for someone. You could see somebody across the street, and if they had long hair, you knew how they thought. You knew that they were into good music. You knew that they were into a reasonable life. You knew that their thought processes. You knew that they probably hated the government. You knew that they probably knew where the best drugs were. You knew that it was someone that you could just nod to and have this understanding between. Anybody that had really short hair, you knew what short hair meant. Strange, isn't it?
A style, a flag of membership, a conscious act of defiance. What made long hair such a confusing and profound symbol was that it could mean any and all of these things. And to the dismay of the older generation, millions of young people suddenly began to care a great deal about looking like they didn't care how they looked.
The sign says, keep up the grass. Keep up the grass. The sign says, keep up.
Use of another drug, marijuana, would further separate members of this generation not only from their parents, but also from their inhibitions.
Ass was important because it did describe us, like them and us, kind of. Of course, we all grew up 18, 19, 20 years of being rigid little, puppets or something. And suddenly the grass relaxed us. It allowed us to be the people we really are, or really were.
60s, this belief that happiness could be a goal in itself would take on historical significance.
To be happy? What does it mean?
Let me put it this way to you. Do you think this country, at this time, needs something that it hasn't got?
Yes.
What does it need?
Love. The whole people have to know each other,
What about people older than, say, 30? Older people. Do you think they can indulge in this too?
Yes, they should.
Do they?
I don't know if they do, but they should.
What do you think older people think of all this?
Most of them think it's ridiculous.
Why do you think they think it's ridiculous?
Because I don't think it can be done.
Are you a part of the love generation?
Yes.
Do you love me?
Yes, I love everybody.
Is it possible to love everybody?
Yes.
How come? How come people haven't loved everybody for 2,000 years?
Because they've been mixed up.
Be happy, love one another. Age-old concepts, but at a time of unprecedented affluence, a time when much of society was still clinging to 1950s conformities, most importantly, a time when the massive baby boom generation was coming of age, these concepts would emerge as the guiding doctrines of a values revolution, what would come to be known as the counterculture.
Do you take drugs?
Huh?
Do you take drugs?
No.
Would you ever take drugs?
Yes.
You would?
Yeah.
Why?
I'm experimental. I'm experimental.
What a lot of the members of the counterculture came to see was that changing people's cultural values may have to do with changing their state of consciousness. And hence you get this fascination with anything that will change people's mode of perception. They open the doors of perception, right? It could be drugs. The fascination with drugs was not fun and games in the 60s. For many people, it was a way to see reality differently and hopefully, therefore, to change your values.
I've taken acid 3 times. That's all. And I reckon you people ought to know about acid, too. Acid's a hoax. Biggest hoax of the century. Acid doesn't exist. Don't you know it's tasteless, odorless, colorless? Just something in the mind.
Here's one of the truly fateful twists in this tale of cultural rebellion. A collision that put the most potent psychochemical ever invented, LSD, into the hands of millions of young people passionately searching for something new. LSD was only vaguely understood by the most qualified researchers. What was LSD doing to these people?
I believe that the inner body, the inner soul, that we don't need money and we don't need the cars and other things. In fact, I've had the feelings that I want to give away all my things to people who need them, who want to live in the society with others, and start anew inside myself.
This was a question that the authorities were very interested in. Everybody that took LSD felt that they were undergoing enormous personal changes. They weren't the same person after having LSD. And there was a scientific study. It was done by a Rand scientist. And in 1966, he published his findings. And what he said was, even though all of these people said that they felt enormous changes had taken place, the personality test showed that they were largely the same person in every area but one area. And this was called the Ways to Live scale. The Ways to Live scale indicated that one dose of LSD stimulated enormous changes, whereas the person taking the test might have said, it's important for me to get a corporate job, it's important for me to have a good car. After one dose of LSD, they were saying, I think maybe a contemplative lifestyle might be what I want to have. I think I'd like to travel before settling down. I think maybe I want to look for some spiritual value in my life. Things totally changed around.
I took a hit of Osley White Lightning acid, and I became an instant hippie. I fell in love with nature, and I looked at the rocks. I could sit there looking at weeds that were normally an item of horror to my parents, and trip on the intricate structures of ragweed and thistleplant. And I began to become a discerning acid head. I only took it every 3 days, mind you, so that I could clean up properly and all. But the real issue was when I went to San Francisco in 1967. In the summer, it was the love that brought me into the hippie movement.
The Council for a Summer of Love proclaims a Summer of Love in the city of San Francisco. We believe that Haight-Ashbury is the focus of a universal spiritual awakening. The Summer of Love is an expression of this awakening. We call upon the world to help us celebrate the infinite holiness of life.
One of the more lasting characters to come out of the hate hippie era is a songwriter, poet, and professional epigrammist with the unlikely given name of Ashley Brilliant. Honest. Mr. Brilliant entertained tourists with lyrics like these.
Hippie Hill, if you've got a lifetime to kill, millions of moments by day and by dark, might as well spend them in Golden Gate Park. You don't have to be mentally ill to enjoy sitting perfectly still, feeling so placid while tripping on acid. It's happening on Hippie Hill.
Sure, people got busted for possession of drugs, but there was a mountainous amount of mind-altering substances available, and at prices that were astonishingly low, even by 1967 standards.
The fellow that bought these paid $10 a piece for them. And say 2 or 3 months ago, they would have gone for $7.50.
Understand that you've taken peyote and marijuana today.
Yes.
How does that affect your consciousness?
LSD, too.
And LSD,
Yes.
all today. How does that affect your consciousness and your ability to cope with questions from the floor?
Well, as you see me now, I appear like any other human being.
This book is dedicated to Stanislav Grof and Christina Hardy. Without Stan, this journey would not have been taken. Without Christina, this book would not have been written. Epigraph. Alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalysts for this. They are tools which are guiding our perception toward deeper areas of our human existence so that we again become aware of our spiritual essence. Albert Hoffman, April 19, 2007. This is one of the most insightful and significant books I have ever read. But to understand its significance and to endorse its message, one must be willing to entertain three premises: that there is an intelligence behind the things that exist in the universe, that there is purpose exhibited by this intelligence, and that it is humanly possible to access some elements of this intelligence and learn some aspects of its purpose. These premises have been debated for millennia, with the debates usually confined to the domains of theology and spirituality. Today, however, they can be raised in the context of the new paradigm emerging in science. If they are raised and debated in this context, the usual objections to using psychedelics to obtain valid knowledge about the universe lose their cogency. If we sit with this emerging body of evidence with an open mind, we recognize, as Beish says, that our mind is a window on the universe, and through this window comes information not only about its physical objects and processes, but also about the agency that lies behind them and the purpose exhibited by this agency. Our window on the universe is not a narrow slit that allows only the penetration of physical information, as mainstream science holds. Under the right conditions, our window opens to holographically complete information sourced in the intelligence that pervades the universe. In its ordinary state, our brain is not equipped to decode all or even most of this information. It is designed to decode only those aspects and segments that are necessary or useful for our immediate life. Under certain conditions, however, the receptivity of the brain can be increased, and these aspects and segments can be expanded. There are many ways of doing this, and it is immaterial which means are chosen, as long as they are effective and do not damage the brain, the rest of the organism, or the web of life in which the brain and the organism are embedded. Among the various methods for expanding our field of awareness, such as holotropic breathing, meditation, and trance dancing, Beish shows that psychedelics are a particularly powerful method when used in a safe and therapeutically structured manner. Of course, we need to distinguish valid and real information from misleading and illusory information. Under the influence of psychedelics, we get an expanded stream of information, and most of that stream is still considered illusory by the modern mind. We need to take steps to ensure that the information we apprehend through the chemically modified receptivity of our brain is genuine, even when it goes beyond the modern mind's understanding of reality. When we recognize the validity of these premises, our mind becomes more receptive to the information that reaches us in these expanded states. As we do, we apprehend deeper and wider layers of reality and come closer to understanding the purpose of our existence. This is amply illustrated in Beish's fascinating and courageous integration of the deep domains of consciousness that open under the influence of LSD. Calling Down Heaven. The visionary story that I'm telling in this book is not a story of escape into transcendence, but one of deepening sacred presence on earth. The reality of a spiritual universe surrounding our physical universe is a great truth, but it is only half a truth. The other half is the long evolutionary gestation of the physical universe inside this spiritual universe, and the progressive infusion of the mother universe into the daughter universe over a vast time frame. The creative intelligence that gave birth to space-time and to everything in space-time thinks in terms of magnitudes that dwarf our horizons. We are waking up inside a garden that has been in the making for billions of years, with billions more still to come. From this perspective, the purpose of spiritual awakening appears to be not escaping from physical existence, as these early religions proposed, but awakening ever more completely inside physical existence and participating in its continuing self-emergence through our awakening. If this feels initially disappointing, it may be that we are still underestimating what the fruition of the divine project on this planet might look like. The intaking of sacred awareness and the activation and stabilization of our innate capacities is the long and patient work of reincarnation. And I believe it is the long work of psychedelic practice as well, at least after the early excitement of discovery passes. In our later sessions, we are no longer running to explore a universe out there, but rather are calling down heaven, pulling higher states of awareness into our physical being, alchemically mixing heaven and earth in the vessel of our human body. When nirvana, enlightenment, and samsara, cyclic existence, are truly one, when full transparency lives in the sea of perpetual change, then heaven is realized on earth, and there is no felt need to go elsewhere.
Which people are surprised. They've been used in India, in Europe, in South Africa. A new species was just found, psilocybe maluti. But the Basotho and Lesotho and province have been using it obviously for hundreds of years. We know this because they have songs. So it's really interesting when indigenous people are using psilocybin mushrooms and scientists, quote, discover them and give them a Latin binomial. But the psilocybin mushroom revolution is happening all over the world right now. I never expected it to be this big. And the RAND report came out this past year. 3% of Americans tripped on psilocybin in 2023. That's
only 3%?
3%. That's 8 million. I know. Well, I would agree with you because how many people would admit it, right? How many,
right.
Probably underreporting, not
for
overreporting.
sure. Yeah, for sure.
So it seems to be, I think, a revolution for the freedom of consciousness. And it's crossing all political boundaries, all religious boundaries.
Well, it's happening here in Texas for sure because of the Ibogaine initiative and what's happening with Governor Rick Perry, who was former Republican governor of Texas, who is all in on this.
He's a great guy. I've talked to him backstage a few times, and he's the type of person that I really admire because even though we may have political differences or different cultural backgrounds, we're joined together with a common purpose of trying to help people.
Yeah, well, he's not ideologically captured. Like, he realized that he was wrong, and then his position on this was based on ignorance. So he educated himself and completely turned around, did a 180, and now is an advocate. And it's helped a lot of people. It's tremendous benefit to veterans and people with PTSD and coming back from the war, and it's one of the only things that's been shown to really get these people straight.
That and psilocybin, and my heart really goes out, and I'm sort of a little left of center, so my friends will be surprised, but my heart goes out to law enforcement. Can you imagine stopping a car on a stormy night at 2 a.m?
Right.
And the window comes down, and you have 2 seconds to make a decision.
Yeah.
You do that hundreds of times.
Mm-hmm.
The likelihood of having one mistake is very high, and having one very bad day define your life for the rest of your life is not right.
No.
Because then if you can't resolve those issues as a soldier, as a law enforcement, as a doctor who makes a mistake, if you can't get through that turmoil, that stress,
right,
the anger that then can emanate out from your anger at yourself to other people, then this is what psilocybin and Ibogaine and other psychedelics, I think, really do. They help people forgive themselves and become better people. And once you forgive yourself and become a better person, then everyone is excited about the fact that you've changed. We talk about using psychedelics and psilocybin and other substances for treating people who have trauma, mental illness, addiction issues. But what about the near normals? But what about prevention?
Yeah.
If the return on investment is to reduce addiction and crime and all the other collateral damage that's associated with it, then It would save hundreds of billions of dollars. Hundreds of billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Psilocybin should be made free, I think.
Yeah.
You know, as a citizen's right to have access, and the government should pay for it. It would massively reduce our national debt. It would make our better society, but that's not going to happen.
The discovery and widespread use of LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, or acid, unleashed powerful scientific and social forces in the 1950s and 1960s. Scientific in that the drug firmly established the legitimacy and power of the new discipline of psychopharmacology, how brain chemistry affects subjective experience, both normal and abnormal. Socially, in its power to heighten the intensity of countercultural impulses previously latent in the post-World War II West. These impulses found their outlet in massive protest movements against a host of societal ills.
Image of the anti-war protesters, and of course women were writing articles about feminism. All of these images were reinforcing. And the reinforced message was, it's right to rebel.
Suddenly, there were hundreds of new organizations, formed by small groups of people who felt a common cause. In New York City, Puerto Ricans joined the Young Lords. In South Dakota, the American Indian movement aimed to right wrongs a century old.
I was sitting in prison, looking at this whole movement, the civil rights and the anti-war movement passing us by. And I wanted to get out so bad to be part of this movement that was going on. There was a new feeling out there of a different kind of patriotism to human rights, patriotism to life instead of death. I wanted to be part of it. I mean, just going to the police department in mass, there was like 200 of us going right directly to the police department. Here we were scared to go to the police department just 2 weeks before that. Scared to go by ourselves. But yet, I found strength with 200 of us going up, all Indian people. All Indians who had been beaten, who had been mugged, who had been arrested. Now here we were going back to that same police department that arrested us, and we were demanding action. And it felt good to finally sense there was power in unity, there was power in numbers.
Claimed they were inspired by the Black Power movement, particularly by the gun-toting Black Panther Party, which had come to prominence in Oakland, California. But in fact, the Black Panthers were a far more sophisticated political organization than their white imitators would ever be, and had a far different agenda.
What they represented for the Black community was something extremely positive. They represented, in a sense, a new and different form of what we traditionally call in our community talented tenth. This is the notion that the best of our community has to put its education and resources at the disposal of the community. Prior to the middle 60s, that had always been defined in terms of highly educated middle-class Black people. Here, on the other hand, we have relatively uneducated young Black street people who find that they have resources within themselves, which through organization can begin to transform the community. That's why they caught on so fast. They represented the organizational expression of all the people on the corners without work, outside in the schoolyards without an education, without an identity, but with an agenda for manhood and for achievement, hopefully, in this country.
The 10-point program. Number one, we want freedom. We want the power to control the destiny of our Black community. Number two, we want full employment for our people. Number three, we want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. Number four, we want...
Most white Americans saw only their guns and heard only their violent rhetoric. But Black militant groups like the Black Panthers were the demanding voice of a younger generation that had given up on Martin Luther King's nonviolent tactics. Their implied threats of violence and their radical political agenda made them extremely frightening to mainstream America.
Nixon policy advisor admits he had invented the war on drugs to suppress anti-war left and black people. And this is this is pretty amazing. Dan Baum, who was writing a book, interviewed John Ehrlichman. And this was back in 1994. But he's now writing about this. He says, at that time, I was writing a book about the politics of drug prohibition. I started to ask Ehrlichman a series of earnest, wonky questions that he impatiently waved away. You want to know what this is all about? He asked with the bluntness of a man who, after public disgrace and a stretch in federal prison, had little left to protect. And now quoting John Ehrlichman, this was Richard Nixon's right-hand man. Quote, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then heavily criminalizing both, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And then the author, Dan Baum, writes, I must have looked shocked. Ehrlichman just shrugged. Then he looked at his watch, handed me a signed copy of his steamy new spy novel, The Company, and led me to the door.
I wanted to bring up that on the, CIA, you were bringing up the CIA. How many drug programs have the CIA funded? Like acid and smuggling heroin and coke and crack and Iran-Contra, the CIA seems intertwangled, if you want to use the clinical term, with drug research, distribution, manufacturing, etc.
Yeah, and of course these are hard answers to question because there isn't always the best transparency with CIA. They don't have the best.
Well, heroin we know during Vietnam, that they smuggled in. Iran-Contra we know, working with the cartels. Crack we know. What about the LSD and the crazy psychotropic?
Oh, definitely. I mean, they definitely were doing psychedelic drug experiments without question. There's the death of Frank Olson. There's the death of a guy named Harold Blower. I don't know if you know that story.
No.
He was a tennis player who got a divorce, was depressed post-divorce, checked himself into a psychiatric hospital to deal with his post-divorce depression. They started doing drug experiments on this guy who's just like a normal dude. Right. And they injected him with so much MDA that he died. They gave him a fatal overdose of MDA, and it was a really high dose. It wasn't like he was sensitive or had a congenital heart defect or something. It killed him with the MDA. That's known. They were involved in a lot of weird drug experiments, and the exact boundaries of what they were and weren't involved with is to this day unclear. I just actually uncovered a new one recently that isn't publicly really known. It's very strange, and it's kind of a
as opposed to everything else we were talking about today.
It's kind of a long story, but it comes back to Alexander Shulgin, this chemist that I was talking about previously.
Then you worked with him at some point, didn't you?
I visited him many times before he died, and he's my hero. He's someone who I really loved. And he created an enormous number of drugs, but because they were all psychedelics, back to what we were talking about previously, no one ever thought you can develop these as medicines, but there was one exception.
Did he think that you could?
He thought they had medical value, but he was also a realist and understood
He's a chemist, but was he kind of like a hippie?
He definitely believed in the psychedelics and thought they had medical value. I think he was more scientifically, medically oriented than counterculturally oriented, but he was part of both. And he had created this one compound that was a psychedelic that wasn't quite psychedelic. It was almost like a microdose intrinsically. It never became psychedelic. It was but there was something there. And it was developed through phase 2 clinical trials, and then clinical development was discontinued, and nobody ever knew why, including Shulgin himself. And I may have Well, I did recently find some reason to believe that there was CIA involvement.
Really?
Yes. Yeah.
2 CIA scientists quickly boarded a plane bound for Switzerland with $240,000 in cash. Not one drop of LSD should be left at Sandoz. They were to buy it all. Once arrived, they met with the heads of Sandoz and struck a deal. Sandoz would send the agency 100 grams per week and keep the agents abreast of any requests for Delicid from the Eastern Bloc. LSD had joined the arms race. Chapter 7. Academic Espionage. Lucy in disguise with doctors. Should the course of recent history have been slightly different from what it was, I can easily imagine a congressional meeting being extremely critical of the agency for not having done investigations of this nature. Sidney Gottlieb. Thank God there is something decent coming out of our bag of dirty tricks. We are delighted. Alan Dulles. Truth Serum. MKUltra led a most surreptitious life. While it saw much potential in LSD, the program dealt with a variety of chemicals and compounds. But it was LSD that dazzled agency personnel the most. Multiple sub-projects under MKUltra quickly developed. Such tactics like dosing unsuspecting government officials with LSD at the office and during countryside work retreats, slipping LSD to regular civilians in CIA safe houses and asylum patients, and giving various chemicals to children at undisclosed laboratories all fill out those opaque years. It gets messy. In Poisoner-in-Chief, journalist Stephen Kinzer suggested that the CIA sought a way to control the human mind with nothing less than global mastery in sight. However, there is little evidence to support his claim. The surviving MKUltra source materials strike this historian as more paranoid than bold, reading closer to a bizarrely histrionic fear of communism than anything like a plan for global hegemony. Might MKUltra have evolved into a totally dominating force over the planet if it survived? Perhaps. But that doesn't seem to have been the agency's motive. At no point do we find documents mentioning global mastery or anything of that sort. The first CIA tests occurred as in-house dosings of LSD. MKUltra head, Gottlieb, while being grilled by Senator Robert Kennedy in 1977, later remarked on that period when there was an extensive amount of self-experimentation, for the reason that we felt that a first-hand knowledge of the subjective effects of these drugs were important to those of us who were involved in the program. Remarkably, most dosings were taken in stride. But every now and then someone had a harsh reaction. The number of agents and lower-level office employees dosed will remain unknown, though a few anecdotes survive. For example, one dude descended into agony when he realized the ultimate truth about automobiles. They had been invented to turn into monsters and eat him. By the end of the day, he was relieved to be perfectly fine, although somewhat embarrassed by his behavior. Perhaps these adolescent pranks were not the best methods for unlocking the secrets of Delicid. Some agency officials started to wonder if they could use some help from researchers who had already been experimenting with mind drugs. Ideally, doctors already employed by a government body. One of the first tapped by the CIA was Dr. Charles Savage. Savage had considerable experience working with mescaline during the latter half of the 1940s. His extensive inquiries made him question psychoactive drug therapy. One alcoholic whom he assisted in 1949 was so guarded that he would not even admit to drinking. However, after a few sessions, the drinker finally opened up to Savage, admitting that what he had been revealing to the doctor over the past 3 months was a mass of ingeniously constructed fabrications, many even lies. Savage's conclusion regarding this particular volunteer was that the mescaline caused the doctor-patient relationship to progress too quickly for him. The patient eventually stopped seeing Savage altogether. Although Savage ended his mescaline studies ultimately indecisive regarding psychoactive treatment, he pounced on the opportunity to work with a new mind drug, a wonder child that supposedly trumped the mescaline experience and only necessitated microscopic doses. The State Department, CIA, and U.S. Navy, of course, heavily monitored the LSD imports coming from Sandoz, and in 1952 Savage received his very own supply. But Savage might not have been the best doctor with which to start. He was a true intellectual, infinitely curious and little concerned with the opinions of his overseers. He graciously accepted government paychecks and support, all the while continuing along with his own research interests. For Delicid fascinated him beyond any covert motive. The opinions and assertions contained herein, declared Savage in his first report on the use of LSD in 1952, are the private ones of the writer, and are not to be construed as official or reflecting the views of the naval service at large. Savage sought a different approach to Delicid, one self-evident today, but novel in his day. Focusing on a vague possibility that had come up during Stoll's first descriptions of his tests with Delicid, Savage decided to study the euphoric nature of the drug, specifically, if such euphoria might be of value in the treatment of depression. However, this strategy seemed to rely heavily on how responsive a person was to the ego-death experience. As many seasoned psychonauts will concur, bad trips usually arise as a result of a person fighting the experience. Their ego is dissolving, and they do not want to let it go. And while Savage never used the term ego death, we can certainly feel that sentiment in his following description. Some individuals find the distortion of reality too threatening, and instead of euphoria, there is a heightened anxiety, a desperate holding on and an effort to maintain control of the situation, together with a heightened suspicion of the motives of others and hypochondriacal concern over the above symptoms. Various forms of mental hell awaited those who simply would not surrender their ego to the experience. One person complained it was like being caught in a burning building. Another thought it was like going under ether. A third that it was like hanging off a cliff. But deeper than the surface reports of physiological vacillations and various manias bubbled up some truly bizarre episodes. Take Miss B, who had been hospitalized for 15 years. A hebephrenic schizophrenic, Miss B usually spent her spring days giggling and laughing about the birds and the flowers. After ingesting 100 micrograms of Savage's LSD, all joy fell from her face. She grew emotionally cold, distant. Her mutters became more and more disjointed. The next morning, Miss B still felt distraught from the experience. Still serious, still aloof. When Dr. X asked her about the previous day, Miss B replied with a cold glare. "This is serious business. We are pathetic people. Don't play with us." Fascinated by the fluctuations in Miss B, the doctors gave her another 100 micrograms of LSD. At one point, while sitting with her psychiatrist, Miss B looked off into space and talked to someone out there. Later that afternoon, she soiled herself, stripped nude, attacked the hospital staff, and made sexual overtures to the head nurse. Miss B ended her second LSD session by climbing on top of a projector screen in the common area and hanging nude. Alan Dulles, ever firm in his convictions, addressed a hearty crowd at Princeton University in 1953. Speaking on the brain perversion techniques employed by the Soviets, Dulles warned, "The minds of selected individuals who are subjected to such treatment are deprived of their ability to state their own thought. Parrot-like, the individuals so conditioned can merely repeat the thoughts which have been implanted in their minds by suggestion from outside. In effect, the brain becomes a phonograph, playing a disc put on its spindle by an outside genius over which it has control." If we are to go by what Dulles thought about using mind drugs to control a person, then Savage did inadvertently create a kind of Manchurian candidate. His particular patient, we are left wondering what he suffered from, if anything, took Delicid, and while it did not turn him into a phonograph, the patient nonetheless complained that the LSD turned him into a television set, and that someone was controlling him by sending him impulses. Not only could that someone control him, but could even read his mind and everything the individual was seeing. The someone else was conceived to be the doctor, who by using LSD may have gained this ascendancy over the subject. As more and more doctors signed on to accept money from the CIA, more questions were raised about LSD. They overwhelmed the small cadre of inner circle CIA scientists. Early on, Gottlieb and Richard Helms, the deputy director of the CIA, channeled some of MKUltra's budget money into research grants via three fronts: the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, and the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, mentioned earlier. This latter organization held two conferences, one in 1956 and the other in 1959. The Geschichte Fund received a cumulative sum of $2 million from the CIA over a period of 20 years. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology funded research that tested drugs and radiation on children. And perhaps that original McCurdy grant that Wrinkle received for his initial LSD research had some kind of link back to Wendt, chairperson of the psychology department at the University of Rochester with ties to the CIA, who was contracted to work on the U.S. Navy's mind control initiative, Project Chatter. Not to entertain conspiracy theories, although when we consider the very real practice of the CIA using dummy fronts to funnel money to researchers, it's not so outlandish, but perhaps Wendt and someone from the McCurdy Company kicked it in Rochester. After all, Gilbert McCurdy sat on the board of trustees at the University of Rochester. It just seems odd, in retrospect, that some random family-owned department store company in Rochester, New York, would care to sponsor or had even heard of LSD research in 1951. The academic world, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, helped provide badly needed answers to some pressing national security problems in the shortest possible time without alerting potential enemies to the U.S. government's interest in these matters. The amount of available, reliable data on LSD and similar materials was essentially nil. Feelings within the academic community split between those who cooperated with the CIA and those who avoided what felt like an unholy alliance. Some, like National Institute of Health researcher Dr. John Lilly, outright refused to participate. Others, like DeShone at Boston Psychopathic Hospital, felt differently. I didn't see any objection to this. We never gave LSD to anyone without his consent and without explaining it in detail. It really boils down to who followed the prescriptions that DeShone would recommend, and who administered LSD in far more irresponsible ways. If we are to believe Gottlieb, MKUltra took place in academic and other research settings. These projects have always represented the work that the individual investigators would have been doing in any case. The degree of wittingness of the principal investigators on these projects varied depending on whether we judged his knowledge of our specific interest to be necessary in providing useful results to us. Thus, many projects were established in which the principal investigator was fully knowledgeable of who we were and exactly what our interests in the research were. Others were simply provided funds through a covert organization and had no idea of ultimate CIA sponsorship. Gottlieb also chose investigators that he believed would ensure adequate safeguards for the volunteers. Most doctors who received grants from the CIA did in fact follow highly strict guidelines when testing human subjects. However, some CIA-funded doctors exhibited unethical practices. Under the auspices of the MKUltra group, these doctors broke numerous laws concerning medical malpractice. Dr. William Henry Wall frantically phoned his concerned wife, Hallie Ann. He had been locked away at the Lexington, Kentucky Addiction Center for over a month now. Some days he would drink his water or eat his lunch, and suddenly the walls would start to undulate around him. The air hummed with unearthly vibrations, and the faces of those around constantly shifted from human to animal to gargoyles and back to human again. Wall started to sweat profusely and experience goosebump skin and a racing heart. He would feel himself grow huge, then imagine he had shrunk to the size of his own thumb. The doctors, he whispered frantically to Hallie Ann, were poisoning him. But how? And with what? He hadn't tasted anything in his food or drink. Wall, once a respected physician and two-time Georgia senator, had taken a fall that had all the makings of a Shakespearean tragedy. After a minor oral procedure, his dentist prescribed the opioid Demerol to help with the pain. As sometimes happens in these situations, Wall developed an unhealthy addiction to the narcotic that eventually landed him in prison. Due to the nature of his crime, drug dependency, authorities granted Wall the opportunity to take residence at a so-called narcotic farm, or narco, a low-security rehab house that had been set up in the 1920s and 1930s. The main agenda of the Lexington, Kentucky Addiction Center was the confinement and treatment of persons addicted to the use of habit-forming drugs. However, there was another, more ominous side to the center. Human experimentation with LSD at this particular narco received funds from the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, which funneled money to Dr. Harris Isbell. Inmates at the narco became guinea pigs for MKUltra. Wall had expected a 4-month stretch at the addiction center in Lexington, but his mind was needed by the researchers. And so he stayed a resident at the center for an additional 4 months with no explanation as to why. Wall's son believed the unprecedented extension was so the doctors could observe and record his behavior following the drug assault. In their article, The Lexington Narcotic Farm, Doctors Thomas R. Costin and David A. Gorlick list several names among the leadership of the farm's doctoral members, including Doctors Lawrence C. Kolb Sr., Clifton K. Himmelsbach, and George E. Valent. One name not listed among the leadership is that of Isbell, despite the infamy he earned during his tenure at the addiction center. Highlights, or lowlights depending on one's perspective, of Isbell's career included giving 7 recovering heroin addicts LSD for 85 days straight. However, LSD is a very adaptable drug. One quickly develops a tolerance to it. In response, Isbell increased the dosages as necessary with each passing day, filling those unfortunate addicts with merciless amounts of LSD. In the end, Isbell found no evidence that his volunteers suffered any damage from their multiple-dose LSD experience. At least, this is what James Ketchum, a CIA physician who worked at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, wrote in his apologist, Chemical Warfare, Secrets Almost Forgotten. There has never been a follow-up study on those poor drug-addicted subjects. Therefore, Ketchum's words cannot be confirmed. However, Isbell wrote in a personal memo that the volunteers tended to be afraid of the doctors and were not as open in describing their experiences as the experimenters would have wished. At the Lexington Addiction Center, rumors circulated among the patients that signing on as a test subject came with an added bonus. As a reward for volunteering, each addict received either a small supply of the narcotic of their choice or a reduced sentence. Most took the narcotics. Wall was one of those inpatients who had refused the barter, but he was unique. Nonetheless, Isbell dosed him with LSD against his will. Other inpatients jumped at the chance to score pure dope and safely shoot up with the staff's blessings. One young man was so eager to participate in the barter system that he lied about his age. 19-year-old Eddie Flowers had been at the addiction center for a year, but claimed he was 21 so he could participate in the project. Those in charge clearly practiced a lackadaisical approach at this narco, as simply pulling Flowers' file would have revealed his true age. He would soon regret the ruse. Entering the examination room, doctors gave him a small graham cracker. No one told Flowers about the LSD that soaked the small wafer. The experience terrified him. He later recalled, "It was the worst shit I ever had. I was frightened. I wouldn't take it again." Isbell ran a very tight protocol. Pulse rate, systolic and diastolic blood pressures, respiratory rate, and rectal temperature were determined at hourly intervals, after 10 minutes rest in bed, and 2 hours before and 8 hours after administration of the drug. But he also demonstrated a willingness to lie in his published works with LSD. In one of his earlier papers outlining how LSD affected recovering morphine and heroin users, he not only neglected to mention the barter system, but even went so far as to claim that the volunteers had been abstinent from opiates for 3 months or more when these studies were carried out. This is most certainly not true. He was quite literally trading heroin for volunteer cooperation at that time. Isbell felt the tests and bartering system perfectly ethical, having no regrets. Even later in life, after many other MKUltra researchers apologized for their reckless actions, Isbell told a Senate subcommittee in 1975 that the barter practices were customary in those days, claiming he and his team did a very excellent job. He further defended himself by asserting a lack of high development in ethical codes at the time, a defense that does not withstand scrutiny. The American Medical Association had debated domestic human experiment considerations as early as 1946. The AMA statutes clearly state, subjects must give voluntary consent, that animal experimentation must precede human experimentation, and that human experiments should be performed under proper medical protection and management. Isbell only followed these statutes if bribery can be considered consent. In April 1950, the Department of Defense's Joint Panel on the Medical Aspects of Atomic Warfare championed the selection of inmates of true volunteer status whose use met the requirements of accepted American standards for the use of human subjects for research purposes. One military official felt that earlier standards and practices were not cruel and unusual, to which former medical director of the Manhattan Project, Shields Warren, replied, "It's not very long since we got through trying Germans for doing exactly the same thing."
Now, though, let's go back to Manson's history in Haight-Ashbury in 1967. A very important Charles Manson-related spot in San Francisco was the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. This is where things start to get darker. As mentioned earlier, many believe this clinic was actually a front for the CIA's MKUltra mind control program. Furthermore, a lot of people are convinced Manson in particular was an MKUltra asset. Manson famously used LSD, acid, to brainwash his followers. Brainwashing people with LSD is something the MKUltra program studied and experimented with extensively. With regards to Manson and this clinic, there are 3 people to keep in mind in particular: Dr. Jolly West, Roger Smith, Manson's parole officer, and Dr. David Smith, founder of the clinic. Roger and David Smith have no family relation. I'm going to be exploring the significance of all three of these people to the story of Charles Manson, starting first with Roger, Manson's parole officer. On March 21st, 1967, Manson was released from prison in Los Angeles. Almost immediately, Charles Manson violated his parole. He was supposed to stay in Los Angeles, yet within days, Manson was in Berkeley, California, about 6 hours north of Los Angeles, right across the water from San Francisco. The following is from Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Quote, "Within days of his release, Manson violated his parole. Unless he had explicit permission, he was supposed to stay in Los Angeles under penalty of automatic repatriation to prison. But practically immediately, he headed to Berkeley, California. Years earlier, Manson had had his parole revoked just for failing to report to his supervisor. But now, for some reason, the police bureaucracy of an entirely different city welcomed him with open arms. When Manson called up the San Francisco Federal Parole Office to announce himself, they simply filed some routine paperwork transferring him to the supervision of Roger Smith, an officer and a student at UC Berkeley's School of Criminology. As a doctoral student, Roger Smith studied the link between drug use and violent behavior in gang members. By 1967, Roger was regarded as an expert on gangs, collective behavior, violence, and drugs. Interestingly, Charles Manson, Roger's one and only parolee, would go on to control the collective behavior of a gang through violence and drugs. It was Roger Smith's idea to send Charles Manson to live at Haight-Ashbury. Roger hoped that Manson could quote-unquote soak up some of the vibes of peace and love in Haight-Ashbury. Maybe it would help neutralize some of Manson's hostile tendencies. And so Manson moved from Berkeley to Haight-Ashbury, crashing wherever he could and never paying rent. End quote. Never paying rent. A lot of very strange things, questions about Manson's time in San Francisco which have yet to be answered. The following is also from Chaos. Quote, "Once Manson landed in Haight-Ashbury, he dropped acid on a daily basis. Roger Smith wrote that Manson seemed to, quote-unquote, accept the world after LSD. Seemingly overnight, Manson transformed himself into an archetypal hippie. Although only in his early 30s, he presented himself as a father figure, attracting young, down-and-out men and women. According to one of my sources, no one knew Manson better than Roger Smith. It would therefore be surprising if Roger Smith didn't know that Manson was breaking the law a lot. Mr. Manson has made excellent progress," Roger wrote in one of several reports he made to the head parole office in Washington, D.C. "Mr. Manson appears to be in better shape personally than he has been in a long time." Roger wrote those words on July 31st, 1967. At the time, however, Manson was sitting in a jail cell. Instead of being sent back to prison, however, Manson, who'd been out of prison for only 4 months at that point, was back on the streets again in a few days. End quote. It's stuff like this which has convinced a lot of people that Manson was in fact some sort of a government asset. Because how is it that Manson could violate his parole by going to San Francisco, yet never be sent back to Los Angeles? Then, how did he end up renting a house in Haight-Ashbury with no money, a house which just happens to be walking distance from a medical clinic which many believe was a CIA front? How is it that Manson was quickly allowed back on the streets of Haight-Ashbury after getting arrested again in July of 67? Again, none of this definitively proves that Manson was a CIA asset, but it certainly raises a lot of questions. Now, I'll be exploring Roger Smith's connection to the clinic shortly, but first I want to take a look at Dr. Jolly West, one of the other key figures from the clinic. Dr. Jolly West was an influential, active participant of the CIA's MKUltra mind control program. This is not a conspiracy. This is extensively well documented. The following is a brief summary of Dr. Jolly West's history with MKUltra by journalist Howard Fisher. Quote, "Some of West's research on mind control was done as part of the CIA's Project MKUltra from 1953 to 73. Illegal human experimentation was done to develop procedures and drugs to weaken people and force confessions through psychological torture and brainwashing. These experiments were conducted at over 80 institutions, which include military bases, universities, and hospitals. Special brothels were even established where customers were secretly dosed with psychoactive substances. The drugs tested included LSD and amphetamines. Sometimes the drugs were combined with electroconvulsive shock treatments, hypnosis, and more. Several people died or were permanently damaged. Now, among his notable work, Dr. West performed psychiatric examinations on Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, of course, being the killer of Lee Harvey Oswald, who had assassinated President John F. Kennedy." End quote. Bottom line, Dr. Jolly West was an expert in mind control. Notably, he also experimented and researched how LSD could be used to brainwash people, permanently influence someone's thought patterns by suggesting things to them. That is exactly how MKUltra experimented with LSD. Coincidentally, it's also how Manson conducted LSD brainwashing. Again, Dr. Jolly West was part of MKUltra, and he was right around the corner from Manson at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. The founder of the clinic was this guy, David Smith. In the mid-60s, before founding the clinic, David was working at the San Francisco General Hospital as the chief of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit. According to Tom O'Neill, David once said the following: "I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, and then I'd walk home past Haight-Ashbury, where I'd see kids who were high on the same substance." This simple observation is quite symbolic. Some people believe the LSD-using hippies of Haight-Ashbury were essentially lab rats being tested on to see what kind of effects LSD would have on them. And off the top of this video, the clinic was shut down shortly after the release of Tom O'Neill's book in 2019. In that book, Tom went into great detail about the CIA connections with the clinic. I'm going to read to you those details from Tom's book momentarily. Before I do, however, I want to familiarize everyone with a few words. In this passage, Tom refers a lot to the drug speed. To be clear, speed is not the same as a speedball. A speedball usually refers to a mixture of cocaine and heroin, though a speedball sometimes can be a mixture of other substances as well. In any case, heroin is known as a downer drug. It slows down the body, whereas cocaine is known as an upper drug. It's a stimulant. Speed is also an upper. Speed is a type of amphetamine drug. Amphetamines, generally speaking, are prescription drugs. Speed, however, although it's an amphetamine, is illegal. Speed can make a user feel happy, but it can also cause unwanted effects such as aggression. Various members of Manson's family involved in the Tate LaBianca killings acknowledged that they took speed before the murders. Now, the following is from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos, where he discusses the controversial history of the Haight-Ashbury Clinic and its connections to Charles Manson and the CIA. Quote, David Smith grew up in Bakersfield, California, about 2 hours north of Los Angeles. He never traveled much beyond his own town before moving to the Bay Area to study at UC Berkeley in 1960. At the end of 1965, a debilitating blackout and a messy breakup led him to giving up alcohol. By then, Dave was a 26-year-old postdoctoral student at UC San Francisco and the chief of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Screening Unit at San Francisco General Hospital. David recalls his curiosity flaring as his research collided with the city's cultural upheaval. "I was injecting white rats with LSD in the lab, and then I'd walk home past Haight-Ashbury, where I'd see kids who were high on the same substance. It was predicted that 100,000 young people would be coming to the area in the near future." David, who felt that healthcare was a right, wondered where these newcomers would receive medical attention and how they would afford it. He moved to Haight-Ashbury himself with plans to start a free clinic. When it opened at 558 Clayton Street in June 1967, the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was an immediate sensation. Staffed entirely by volunteers and unauthorized by the city health department, it treated hundreds of patients a day, offering non-judgmental care for those suffering from bad trips, overdoses, sexually transmitted diseases, and malnourishment, or for those who just needed a kind ear. Lines at the clinic sometimes stretched around the block, with hippies waiting to ascend the creaky wooden stairs to its second-floor office. Inside, loitering was encouraged. The clinic did everything it could to advertise its psychedelic affinities. Exam rooms were painted in aqua and day-glow orange. One of them was wallpapered with a vibrant collage of peace signs, naked bodies, and hypnotic swirls. Even as David struggled to pay the rent and keep the cops at bay, he reveled in his creation. Few things so perfectly encapsulated the utopian ideals of the summer of love. As faces filed in and out of the clinic that summer, David and his colleagues befriended the repeat visitors. The clinic became a scene within a scene. It could be hard to tell the hippies apart with their long, beflowered hair, their upstart communes, their shifting legions of followers and leaders. But decades later, no one at the clinic had any trouble remembering Charles Manson and his girls. In 1971, David Smith published Love Needs Care, a memoir about the clinic's early years. I found it rife with details about Manson and the family during the summer of love, when Manson, apparently at his most charismatic, began to attract followers and ensure their unconditional devotion. Better still, Love Needs Care had a few contributions from Roger Smith, offering his own appraisal of Manson. As invaluable as these portraits are, however, I called them into question when my reporting led me to doubt both Roger and David. The more I reread certain passages, the more they seem like gingerly public relations efforts. David and Roger had to make it clear that they knew Manson well, but of course, the book came out 2 years after the murders, when both David and Roger had an interest in distancing themselves from that Manson, the murderous one, the metaphor for evil. Love Needs Care attempts the delicate task of explaining the relationship the Smiths had with Manson, while making it seem as if they had no idea that he and his followers would someday erupt into unconscionable violence. David Smith described the Manson family's frequent trips to the clinic, where Charlie's girls, as they were known around the halls, were treated for STDs and pregnancies. The girls tended to Manson's every need, never speaking unless spoken to. When the family moved to an apartment on Cole Street, Manson began in earnest to reprogram his followers. David had an elaborate sense of Manson's tactics, although he never explained where he got it. Using a combination of LSD and mind games, Manson forced his followers to submit to unconventional sexual practices, as David wrote. Manson would invoke mysticism and pop psychology as the acid took hold, saying, "You have to negate your ego." Manson treated the girls like objects, eroded their independence, and turned them into quote-unquote self-acknowledged computers, empty vessels that would accept almost anything he poured in. They obeyed him unquestioningly. Acid, LSD, was unmistakably essential to the process. Interestingly, David thought Manson's insistence on LSD sometimes put him at odds with the trends in Haight-Ashbury. Typically, hippies who dropped a lot of acid eventually moved on to another type of drug, speed. A schism grew within the scene. The acid heads preferred nonviolence, whereas the speed freaks caused the rash of violence which destroyed the Haights' live and let live ethos. The Manson family's drug pattern was effectively reversed, with Manson urging his disciples to relinquish speed and embrace acid. Steering his recruits away from speed, amphetamines, from uppers, reduced the chance of interference with his induction process. Speed became a part of the family's lifestyle only later, David told me, when it came time to kill in Los Angeles. He'd heard this from Manson killer Susan Atkins herself when she asked him to assess her mental health for a parole hearing in 1978. When they went to southern Los Angeles, they got very deeply involved in speed, David said. They got it from the Hells Angels. In David's words, they were trading sex for speed, and Atkins thinks that Helter Skelter and the ultimate crime was a paranoid speed delusion. Prosecutor Bugliosi kept any mention of the family's speed use out of the trial. David thought he understood why. It risked presenting mitigating circumstances for the prosecution. And the defense wouldn't want it coming up either. No one wants his or her clients to look like addicts. Over the years, a smattering of evidence and first-hand recollections has suggested that the Manson family used amphetamines more than was originally thought. In a 2009 documentary, Linda Kasabian claimed that she and her companions each swallowed a capsule of speed before leaving for Cielo Drive, the night of Sharon Tate's murder. During the Manson trials, however, she had testified that she hadn't taken any drugs around the time of the murders. In books and at parole hearings, Susan Atkins also later stated that she had taken speed before the Tate murders. Tex Watson wrote that he frequently snorted it with the group and that he too took it on both nights of the murders. Others added that the family kept an abundance of speed at the Spahn Ranch towards the end of their time there, and that Manson himself wasn't above taking it, especially as he grew more paranoid. He would use it to stay awake for days at a time. One reason the Haight-Ashbury Clinic was free, after all, was that David, Roger, and their colleagues had received private and federal grants to conduct drug research there. Both Roger and David were studying amphetamines and LSD, the latter being the crucial component to Manson's reprogramming process. How had an uneducated ex-con like Manson, someone who months ago had never taken acid and maybe never even heard of it, come to use the drug to such sophisticated ends? And wasn't it suspicious, at least, that he was coming to the medical clinic to see two people, David and Roger, who were studying that very phenomenon, the use of drugs to control and change behavior? At least one friend of Roger's had foreseen that it would be a quote-unquote conflict of interest. I always thought there was
the blood of patriots. I do not contend that driving people crazy, even for a few hours, is a pleasant prospect. But warfare is never pleasant. Would you rather be temporarily deranged by a chemical agent or burned alive? Major General William Creasy. They in the agency think I'm a god. Wilson Green. When discussing the personnel who worked with LSD for MKUltra, we might want to consider two distinct groups. The first group comprises those like Hyde, Hawk, and Abramson, independent researchers whom the CIA tapped for one reason or another. These researchers had already been working with LSD and/or mescaline and graciously accepted large funds from the CIA to continue their work. Then there was a second group that we have not met yet. These folks worked with LSD and had direct employment with a government office. In DC, MKUltra researchers had begun to guard everything they ate and drank as if their lives, and minds, depended on it. LSD appeared most advantageous when the person receiving it remained unsuspecting. After all, that was one of the reasons LSD undermined all the other experimental substances. It remained undetectable until only after the effects manifested. Giving LSD to knowing participants, many of them mentally unwell, provided interesting anecdotes, but not much else. Unsuspecting people made the best subjects. This would mean testing LSD without proximate safeguards or consideration of the rights of the individual. It would only be a matter of time before something terrible happened. It was at this point that MKUltra took, perhaps, its darkest turn. Gottlieb and Helms decided that there was only one way to move forward. They had to find unsuspecting citizens to dose. But not just anyone. They needed people who wouldn't be believed when they returned to their regular lives, telling horrific stories of kidnapping and mind control experiments. Gottlieb and Helms felt that three kinds of people fit this profile: mafiosi, barflies, and sex workers. Dealing with the mafia did not tickle the fancy of the MKUltra group. So Gottlieb focused on the more vulnerable of the remaining two groups. As it turned out, someone already had that same idea. Fun, fun, fun. May 1st, 1953. Morgan Hall rented an apartment at 81 Bedford Street in New York's Greenwich Village. He immediately began redecorating. Double glass windows, cameras, microphones, sound recording equipment, a stockpile of illegal drugs, and a bounteous supply of booze. Hall was really George Hunter White, a towering, intimidating figure who made that fruitcake J. Edgar Hoover look like Nancy Drew. His resume was telling. He had made a name for himself training American spies in espionage tactics during the Second Great War. Kept a picture on his wall of the Japanese agent he had killed with his bare hands. Arrested Billie Holiday in 1949 on bogus opium charges. Once used his .22 automatic with silencer to shoot his initials into the wall of a room at the Roosevelt Hotel during a drinking binge. Attempted to send a Cuban sex worker to Fidel Castro with LSD-laced cigars, and, finally, as a member of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, often sampled many of the substances he arrested people for possessing. White had received clearance to open the safe house from his boss, Harry Anslinger, the notorious anti-cannabis crusader and fraud. The idea behind the apartment at 81 Bedford was for White, posing as Hall, to lure both alcoholics and sex workers back to the pad and dose them with LSD. By the summer of 1953, codename Operation Midnight Climax was fully operational. Given the nature of this most foul environment, the tests that took place at the apartment proved unpredictable. Some people experienced horrific visions and cried in the corner. Others experienced euphoria and danced the night away. In a letter to Gottlieb about his time in the apartment, White commented that it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American lie, cheat, rape, and pillage with the sanction of the All-Highest? November 18th, 1953. A team of biological warfare scientists arrived late at night to a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. Camouflaged as a winter meeting of scriptwriters, editors, authors, and lecturers in liquor-free Swanton County, the scientists were actually unwitting guinea pigs for a MKUltra subproject experiment. They settled in and went to sleep. The next day around noon, Gottlieb spiked a small amount of LSD into everyone's contro, notwithstanding 2 men. One had a stomachache and the other was a recovering alcoholic. Roughly 20 minutes after the guests finished their drinks, Gottlieb informed them of the dosing. Once the LSD kicked in, most of the participants, like Robert Lashbrook, laughed incessantly. Others argued philosophy all day and night. Still others grew frightened. Frank Olson and his boss, Colonel Vincent Ruett, noticeably so. Olson yelled at his cohorts and wandered aimlessly around the cabin, muttering to himself. Afterward, feeling he had messed up the experiment, he delivered his resignation to Ruett the following week. Although somewhat secretive due to the nature of his work, Olson was a very warm, family-loving man, according to his wife. Employed at Fort Detrick, he helped establish the Special Operations Division, or SOD, of the Army Chemical Corps, a highly covert research division that prohibited anyone from documenting anything in writing. SOD projects included the development of assassination materials, collaboration with former Nazi scientists, LSD mind control research, and the use of biological weapons during the Korean War. Olson's direct employer was actually the CIA. Returning from the retreat, Olson appeared aloof, a different man than the husband his wife had kissed goodbye a few days earlier. His colleagues put him under the care of Lashbrook, and the two flew to New York and checked into the Statler Hotel on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. Olson was supposedly ashamed to see his family, fearing he might become violent. What took place in New York remains shrouded in mystery. Some say that Olson became erratic, throwing away his wallet and claiming that he just wanted to disappear. But he also phoned his wife at one point, saying he felt fine and looked forward to coming home. In some versions, Lashbrook, Ruett, and Gottlieb attended Olson. In others, Gottlieb never arrived in New York at all. The story, I believe, is that Olson met up with a sleight-of-hand magician, John Mulholland. Gottlieb had employed Mulholland to teach undercover operatives how to apply the magician's art to covert activities, such as slipping drugs into drinks, to dose or poison enemies. His book, The Art of Illusion, had even been downsized to fit into the shirt pockets of service members during the Second Great War. Mulholland harbored no direct affiliation with the CIA. The full extent of his relations with Gottlieb were likewise opaque. He took on these kinds of assignments because his government asked him to. Olson took several trips with Lashbrook and Ruett, and possibly Gottlieb, out to Long Island to see Harold Abramson, the LSD researcher we met in the previous chapter, who invited folks from around Brookhaven to his home for LSD dinner parties. Despite Abramson's qualifications to discuss the LSD experience with Olson, he wasn't a psychiatrist or psychologist, but an allergist. Abramson later claimed that Olson confided that he believed the CIA continually drugged him to cause sleeplessness. Back in New York, only Lashbrook remained with Olson. November 23, 1953. Olson plunged to his death from the 13th floor window of his and Lashbrook's hotel room, 1018A. A cursory investigation resulted in police declaring the death a suicide. The official story? Olson simply went crazy and killed himself. After Olson's death, all LSD testing, including White's apartment, momentarily froze while the CIA decided how to clean up the mess. Several months later, CIA Deputy Director Helms pleaded with CIA Director of Intelligence Dulles to reopen these shady, deplorable apartments. The only operationally realistic way of continuing LSD research, Helms explained, was by monitoring the unwary. The apartment tactics recommenced, but not in New York. Reluctant to have White operating in the same city where Olson had perished, Gottlieb rented another apartment in Telegraph Hill, San Francisco. This time, White wouldn't run the apartment alone. He hired John Gittinger and Ira Ike Feldman to nest in the San Francisco house, obliging the court to find that LSD intoxication is the likely cause of almost any unexplained and superficially inexplicable behavior. Some figureheads in the CIA proposed a flip side to the notion of using the chemical as a means of interrogation. What if LSD's true purpose rested elsewhere? Not as a way to make an enemy talk, but rather as a way to prevent one of our POWs from talking. LSD took on a new role within the agency, as an anti-interrogation serum. Since the reactions that testers observed in their subjects often fluctuated between anxiety, debilitating fear, euphoria, non-sequitur babbling, and uncontrollable laughter, MKUltra researchers felt that American POWs might use LSD much like a non-lethal cyanide capsule and offer an operative temporary protection against interrogation. This radical change from LSD's perceived potential as a truth drug to a lie serum reinforces the simple fact that the CIA's top scientists still had very little understanding of the chemical they busily tried to control. Still, the most sinister aspects of these mind control projects had yet to be seen. At an undisclosed location in Arizona, tests performed by Dr. Wilson Green involved teaching one little girl, Christine DiNicola, not only how to pick locks, but also how to kill dolls that looked like real children. DiNicola recalls, "I stabbed a doll with a spear once after being severely traumatized." As she got older, DiNicola resisted more and more against her training and eventually became so uncooperative that she was put in a cage between tests. Another woman, Claudia Mullen, testified alongside DiNicola at the Presidential Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, or PACRI. The Deep Creek Lake cabin where Olson had his disastrous encounter with LSD was used several other times for far more disreputable purposes, training children as assassins, of which Mullen recalls her involvement. In 1955, Mullen spoke before the PACRI and detailed some of what she remembers of the tests. Not yet a teenager when the sexual humiliation began, Mullen recalls a doctor, Green, telling another doctor that children were used as subjects because they were more fun to work with and cheaper too. They needed lower profile subjects than soldiers and government people, so only young girls would do. Besides, I like scaring them. They and the agency think I'm a god, creating subjects in experiments for whatever deviant purposes Sid Gottlieb and James Hamilton could think up.
Manson. He was going to soothe the savage beast, but unfortunately, instead, the beast grew more savage than ever. When he started the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, David Smith left a loose end dangling in his past. David never actually received his PhD in pharmacology. He'd completed a 2-year research project on amphetamines and their effects on groups of confined mice, but he never finished his dissertation. This surprised many of his closest friends, and in our interviews, David was reluctant to admit it. It wasn't like him to leave something undone. Even in its unpublished form, David Smith's research on mice defined him. In my own obsessive way, I found as much of this research as I could. I saw that Dave had published a brief article based on his study in the Haight-Ashbury Medical Clinic's own house paper, The Journal of Psychedelic Drugs, in 1969. It wasn't nearly as robust as his full thesis would have been, but it gave me something to go on. Before long, I was noticing parallels between David Smith's mice and the Manson family. At first, I was inclined to disregard these as the product of my more speculative side. I saw no purpose in linking the behavior of mice in a controlled experiment to the behavior of people in the world at large. But I took another look when I saw that Dave Smith himself had made such a connection. He spoke of his mice as proxies for human beings. His research started with 16 albino mice. With the same assistance of other researchers, he separated these two into groups of 8 in aggregate settings. Small, closely confined communities intended to stimulate crowding. They injected the mice with amphetamines. Over the next 24 hours, they transformed from docile animals into frantic combatants, fighting one another until they died either from injuries, self-inflicted wounds from over-grooming, or simple exhaustion. The violence was unremitting. Dave Smith described quote-unquote frenzied attacks of unrelenting rage. Afterward, all that remained in the blood-spattered cages were scattered, dismembered body parts. Simply by confining the animals in close quarters, he'd increased the toxicity of the amphetamines more than 4 times. In another attempt, some of the mice were dosed with other chemicals before they received amphetamine injections. The extra drugs sometimes had a sorting effect, segregating the mice that would kill from the mice that wouldn't. Or they had a soothing effect, all but eliminating the violent tendencies. David Smith told me he'd started his research having foreseen an influx of amphetamine abusers in San Francisco. He didn't say how he'd predicted that influx, but he was right. In the summer of 1967, as he opened his clinic, amphetamines exploded in popularity in Haight-Ashbury. David Smith told me, quote-unquote, when the speed scene hit, it was a total shock to everybody. Suddenly, what I learned in pharmacology relative to amphetamines was now applicable to people. Throughout his work, Love Needs Care, David Smith draws parallels between the rodents he'd studied and the speed-addled hippies in the Haight. The mice on speed, he wrote, became inordinately aggressive and assaultive, turning upon one another with unexpected savagery. Their violent behavior is probably intensified by confinement, for it is strikingly similar to that observed in amphetamine abusers who consume the drugs in crowded atmospheres. In the Haight, David Smith watched as people took huge doses of speed, inspiring paranoia and hallucinations. Once peaceful and well-adjusted, the speed freaks of San Francisco lashed out with murderous rage at any real or imagined intrusion, assaulting, raping, or torturing to relieve the paranoid tension. As David Smith concluded, quote-unquote, cut off from the straight world, crammed together in inhumane conditions and controlled by chemicals, they behaved quite naturally like rats in a cage. But when I spoke to David Smith, he was quick to discount these parallels. I happened to study amphetamines before they hit Haight-Ashbury, he said. The Haight didn't give me the idea. It's kind of like a historical accident. I was studying LSD before LSD hit the Haight. Now, according to Dr. Eugene Schoenfeld, who participated in a portion of Dave Smith's rat research in 1965, LSD was an integral component of the project. David and his colleagues would inject the rats with LSD in hopes of making them more suggestible before he gave them amphetamines. Suggestibility was among the most prized effects of LSD from a clinical perspective, and yet David kept LSD out of the official documentation of his research. The article he had published in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs never mentioned acid. I asked David if LSD was part of his protocol. He denied it. Then, a moment later, without provocation, he reversed himself. Yes, I stuck LSD in them, he said. But he couldn't explain why. I was sticking all different kinds of drugs in them, he added. In his recollection, LSD, quote-unquote, produced disorganized behavior, but not violent behavior. The rats would just wander around in a daze. If you've noticed that I've used rats and mice interchangeably, there's a reason for that. David Smith used them interchangeably too, even though rats and mice have two vastly different behavioral patterns, especially in groups. In his Journal of Psychedelic Drugs article, he calls them mice. In Love Needs Care and another book he published, they're rats. Schoenfeld insisted that he'd work with rats during this part of the research, but Smith was adamant that they were mice, and he couldn't explain his confusion on the subject. According to his own academic papers, some of David Smith's research was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. This organization, the National Institute of Mental Health, has acknowledged that the CIA used it as a front for LSD research. And, though David never mentioned it in his writing, his work owed a clear debt to the landmark research of another National Institute of Mental Health psychologist, John B. Cahoon, who'd studied rat populations since 1946. Cahoon reported that rats in confined groups, even without drugs, became uncharacteristically aggressive. They'd erupt into rape, murder, cannibalism, and infanticide, killing babies. A dominant male rat emerged, subjugating other males into a tribe of cowering and feeble followers, and organizing female rats into a quote-unquote harem of sex slaves. The strangest group to emerge were hypersexualized male rats that stalked and raped both males and females and often cannibalized their young. These hypersexualized male rats would commit frenzied and berserk attacks against rat families sleeping in their burrows, leaving the remains of half-eaten victims. Again, no drugs were involved here. These hyper-aggressive rats emerged simply as a result of their confinement. They deferred only to the dominant male rat, fleeing if he caught sight of them. Cahoon's study was a watershed. In the mid-60s, amid growing concerns about population density, social scientists, politicians, and journalists cited his work to explain the riots in America's overcrowded ghettos. Calhoun's term, the quote-unquote behavioral sink, entered the scientific lexicon almost right away. The behavioral sink is defined as, quote, the outcome of any behavioral process that collects animals together in unusually great numbers, aggravating all forms of pathology that can be found within the group. David Smith used this term extensively, behavioral sink, in his writing and in his interviews with me. Though David never mentioned Cahoon by name, his research was essentially a continuation. He sought to control the pathology of rats, or mice, in crowded environments by aggravating them with amphetamines. He concluded that amphetamines were more toxic to rats in groups than rats alone. Their crowding essentially exasperated the effects of the stimulant, and this conclusion, like so much in David's research, confused me. I didn't see how it could be objective and unbiased. According to Cahoon, the rats' violence wasn't intensified by the confinement, but rather it was created by it. Therefore, what difference did it make if David shot them up with amphetamines? It seemed like the equivalent of studying drunk, inexperienced ice skaters to learn about alcohol intoxication. The novice skaters were going to fall down on the ice anyway, regardless of whether they'd been drinking or not. Plus, the more interesting subtleties of Cahoon's research, the emergence of a dominant male rat, a harem of suburban females, and an underclass of other males, all of which, it had to be said, sounded a lot like the Manson family, had gone entirely unnoted in David's project. I wondered if amphetamines, with or without LSD, had increased the dominant male's grip on his followers. Given how eerily David's research prefigured the creation of the Manson family under David's nose in the Haight-Ashbury during the summer of '67, I wondered if he had deliberately underreported it.
She goes and applies to become a police officer. And for years, she's this, hardline cop, right? Takes real pleasure in busting people. But Lee started to notice a few things. But she noticed when you bust a dealer, there's no fewer dealers. There's someone on the corner the next day for sure, right? It didn't seem to be having any effect. In fact, what she discovered, what she began to learn about this was that there was something even worse, which was, for a funny sort of reason, that she realized that she was actually creating these, empowering these gangs. So the best way to explain this is, if you imagine, obviously when you ban drugs, they don't disappear, right? They're transferred from the people who used to control them, licensed legal businesses, to armed criminal gangs, right? And these armed criminal gangs operate in a different way to legal businesses. So if you imagine, if you and me decided we want to go and steal now a bottle of vodka, right? We go into a local liquor store and that store catches us. They'll call the cops will come and take us away. That liquor store doesn't need to be violent, it doesn't need to be intimidating. They've got the power of the law to uphold their property rights. Okay, now imagine we wanted to steal a bag of Coke, right? If we go to the guy near here, I'm sure there is someone who sells Coke, and he catches us, he can't call the cops, obviously. Cops would arrest him. He has to fight us. Now, if you're a dealer, you don't want to be having a fight every day, right? You want to establish a reputation for being so frightening that no one will dare to fuck with you, right? So you establish your place in that neighborhood through aggression, through violence, and you maintain it through aggression and violence, right? Legal businesses compete on cost and quality of product. in illegal markets, people compete on how much of a frightening fucker you're prepared to be, right? As a writer called Charles Bowden put it, the war on drugs creates a war for drugs, right? It transfers it to these criminal gangs who have to operate through violence to protect their property rights. So Lee goes into the drug war thinking, I'm the one stopping these gangs. She realizes, shit, I'm the one enabling them, right? They control one of the biggest industries in the world because of this police action and because of this decision to prohibit these drugs. And if you want to know how much of this violence is caused by the fact that we prohibited it, just ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers, right? Everyone knows who Al Capone was. Does the head of Smirnoff go and shoot the head of Budweiser in the face, right? Does your local bar go and send a bunch of kids to go and shoot everyone in the next bar down? Of course not. Exactly that happened under alcohol prohibition. When did it end? It ended on the day alcohol prohibition ended, because legal markets don't compete with that. So Lee's partly having this insight, right? She's realizing, shit, I think I'm taking down these gangs, I'm actually empowering them. What will really disempower them is reclaiming the market and making it legal. But she also has another really painful realization. So early in her career as a cop, Lee had done this really brave thing. She'd gone undercover with the Klan to expose them. She'd done a really important work in breaking up parts of the Maryland Klan. She really was not a racist, right? She'd had relationships with African-American men. But she noticed something that most honest cops notice, which is the vast majority of people, they were sent to African-American areas to enforce the drug laws, right? One of her colleagues, Matthew Fogg, once went to his superior officer and said, you know, this is a bit weird, right? We only ever seem to go to African-American neighborhoods to do all our drug busts. I'm fairly sure white people sometimes use drugs. Should we go to like a white neighborhood as well? And the supervisor said, of course you're right. White people use drugs. But white people know journalists and lawyers and judges. That's just a whole load of shit for us. Just go for the low-hanging fruit. So Lee, who is not a racist, could see the effect of what she was doing was in fact racist, right? And she was very uncomfortable with that. And this really came to a head for Lee when Lee's police partner was a guy called Ed Totley, who she loved, platonically loved. He was a great champion of women police officers. He was a great guy. And one day she gets a call at home. Ed had been sent on a drug bust. He was undercover. And the guy had thought he was ripping him off and shot him in the head. And Lee goes to see Ed's body and she's like, what did he die for? Right? There are no fewer drug dealers. Every time we arrest a drug dealer, the supply of drugs is not disrupted for 1 hour. We are enforcing a racist war. We are empowering these gangs. Why are we doing this? So Lee quit as a police officer. She retrained as a lawyer. She now gets the criminal records expunged wherever she can of the kind of people that she busted when she was a cop. And she was part of a brilliant group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, who are cops who argue for ending the drug war. But it's interesting to me because it's hard to be Lee was trying to be Harry Anslinger. It's hard to be Harry Anslinger if you're an honest person with a conscience, right? And there are police officers all over the country who are making these realizations now. And that, obviously, it's very close to my heart, what we do to people with addiction problems. Horrific and catastrophic though that is, I don't actually think that's the biggest moral issue around the war on drugs. The biggest moral issue is the violence created by prohibition, right? If I think about places I've spent time like Colombia, Ciudad Juarez in northern Mexico, that's the biggest issue, right? More people have died in Latin America, Central and South America, in the drug war violence than have died in Syria.
So people are aware of this. So people must be confronted with this data. To this day, people know that the prohibition on alcohol was a massive disaster and no one would ever accept it again. We're slowly starting to realize that marijuana, at least for some people, is safe and reasonable and should be used recreationally and has some massive benefits medically. So we're starting to see legalization both for recreational use and clearly for medical use is spread. I think, what did we decide? What was it? I think it's like there's a certain amount of states where it's just fully legal recreationally and more where it's medical. But I think it's more than 18 states total now.
Yeah, soon we're going to be half of the American population.
It should be 100%, right? I mean, we all...
It is in Canada.
And it should be, yes, it is in Canada, as it should be for alcohol. But what is the stop? What is the wall between this and legalization of all these other drugs and counseling.
There's a range of things.
Is public perception a big one?
I think you've gone to the most important, right? So some people say it's the vested financial interest in the existing system. That's true. If you look at who funds the no campaigns whenever they want to legalize marijuana, you can see the interests, right? Prison guard unions, alcohol companies, because they don't want a commercial competitor, religious fundamentalist groups. The main block is huge majorities of Americans, more than 80% say the war on drugs has failed and been a disaster. And yet
The age of heroes was over, and over too, for many of the 60s generation, was faith in a just and fair federal government that would be by and for the people. One event more than any other signifies the end of the era for this group: Watergate. As the sordid facts about the corruption, the spying, and the lying began to seep out from Richard Nixon's White House, Americans realized the truth was even more shocking than Nixon's worst critics had charged. The man who had promised us law and order came to be a lawbreaker himself.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
A profound disillusionment set in among many of the same 60s generation that had been so hopeful a decade earlier. Disillusionment so pervasive and so widespread that by 1973, polls showed more than half the nation believed the federal government was corrupt. Several months later, when Nixon finally resigned rather than face impeachment, Americans were relieved to put Watergate behind them. And the following spring, as the last American soldiers made their hasty withdrawal from Vietnam, ditching their helicopters as they went, another long, unhappy chapter of the 1960s finally reached its end. The reaction was explosive. Over 80% of the nation's campuses declared strikes. Students across the country left their classrooms to protest the widening of the war. Galvanized by Nixon's action in Southeast Asia, the anti-war movement leapt back to life, larger and more confrontational than ever. And they weren't alone. More people from every segment of American society now joined the protests: housewives, professionals, union members, and a significant number of members of Congress.
And I felt good.
That feeling came to be called empowerment. It meant taking control of your own life.
I very much resent the kind of media collaboration which tries to pass off the 60s as a drug-induced euphoria and a failure, and which has misrepresented a lot of our efforts to young people, thinking that it didn't work. Most of the people I know that are still living are carrying on their work. Their style has changed. It doesn't matter if they have long hair or short hair. But they're carrying on that kind of religious intention in their communities, with nature. I don't think it's been a failure. I think the Reagan years are a temporary reaction by the forces that were maybe threatened a little too assiduously during the 60s to regroup and remind themselves that the world paradigm that they understood is not completely shattered. But in fact, it is shattered. The times, they are changing. And I hope perhaps that if succeeding generations of young people could be a little more compassionate and not judge their elders so bitterly and leave the door open for more and more people, that change will continue to escalate. And each time around the spiral, you get a little more wisdom, and the group consciousness clicks just a notch higher.
Yep.
The beat and hippie movements brought the creativity of an anarchistic, artistic subculture and a secret and ancient tradition of transcendental and esoteric knowledge and experience into the mainstream of cultural awareness. It stimulated breakthroughs in every field, from computer science to psychology, and gave us back the sense of being the originators of our lives and social forms, instead of the hapless robot receptors of a dull and determined conformity. The freedoms that have become real to us cannot be beaten back. The values of compassion, creativity, social equality, love, and peace will be victorious over war, fear, control, and injustice. It's up to each of us to work together in creating a world that will survive and flourish.